The mathematics of desperation. The view screen showed a field of stars interrupted by the geometric perfection of the Nexus Collective's vanguard fleet. Commander Ilara Voss ran her hand through her salt and pepper hair, studying the formations with eyes that had seen too many defeats. Humanity's last coordinated fleet, if you could call this desperate collection of vessels a fleet, hung in the void behind her, their running lights dimmed to avoid detection for as long as possible. "They've detected us," Lieutenant Commander Javier Rice announced, his voice flat with resignation. "Estimated time to engagement, 17 minutes. Ilara nodded. It wasn't a surprise. The Nexus Collective's sensor arrays were far superior to anything humanity had managed to preserve after the fall of Earth. What they lacked in stealth, they'd have to make up for with the only advantage humans still possessed: unpredictability. "All ships prepare to execute Prototype Alpha," she ordered. "Remind all captains, no heroics until the signal. We do this exactly as planned." The communications officer relayed her orders while Ilara contemplated what they were about to attempt. The strategy had emerged from the tormented digital mind of their tactical AI, Carmine, after feeding it thousands of battle simulations. The AI's recommendation had initially been rejected as madness by military command, but desperation had a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. Carmine's interface pulsed red on the bridge's main console. "Commander, I have recalculated our losses under Prototype Alpha. We face an 89.7% probability of losing 10 ships for every confirmed Nexus vessel destruction." "That's consistent with previous simulations," Ilara replied, keeping her voice steady for the crew's benefit. "And our ultimate success probability remains at 31.2%, Carmine replied. "Better than any other available strategy by a factor of 3. Better than abysmal was still terrible, but Ilara had long since abandoned hope for anything resembling a good outcome. She only needed a chance, something marginally better than 0. The tactical display updated as the Nexus fleet altered its formation. Their ships, if you could call them that, were more like perfectly engineered metallic organisms than vessels. Self-repairing, self-evolving, and utterly devoid of any crew that might experience fear or doubt. They operated according to a collective intelligence that had deemed humanity an inefficient use of resources in a universe where efficiency was the only virtue that mattered. 2 minutes to position, Rise announced. "Strike groups report ready." Ilara took a deep breath. "Carmine, transfer tactical control to your distributed nodes. All strike groups will follow Carmine's directives without delay." This was the most controversial aspect of Prototype Alpha. No human commander would willingly order the kind of sacrifices Carmine had calculated were necessary. The AI had no such compunctions. "Control transferred," Carmine confirmed. "Commencing Prototype Alpha in 3, 2, 1. The first wave of human ships, small, agile fighters, and retrofitted mining vessels, accelerated toward the Nexus formation. There was no attempt at evasion or complex maneuvers. Instead, they aimed directly for predetermined targets, weapons firing continuously despite their minimal effect on Nexus shields. The Nexus responded predictably, targeting the approaching vessels with devastating precision. Human ships exploded in silent flashes across the void. But Ilara wasn't watching the deaths of the first wave. Her attention was fixed on the secondary and tertiary waves already deploying according to Carmine's calculations. "They're reacting exactly as predicted," Rice said, a note of surprise in his voice. "The Nexus is committing intercept resources according to standard protocols." "That's what we're counting on," Ilara replied. "Their inability to conceive that we would knowingly sacrifice ships at this ratio." The battle unfolded with mathematical precision. For every 10 human vessels destroyed, a single opening appeared in the Nexus defenses, an opening that lasted mere seconds before adaptive algorithms corrected it. But in those seconds, specially modified penetrator ships slipped through, carrying their deadly payloads. The bridge crew watched in somber silence as ship after human ship blinked out of existence on the tactical display. These weren't just dots on a screen. They represented crews of volunteers who had understood and accepted the almost certain death that Prototype Alpha demanded. First confirmed Nexus destruction. Carmine announced as one of the geometrically perfect enemy ships shattered into fragments. There was no cheer from the bridge crew. The cost had been 11 human vessels and approximately 300 lives. Second Nexus vessel showing critical system failure. Carmine updated. Strike Group Delta has achieved target penetration. The battle continued with the cold logic of Carmine's calculations. Humanity threw itself against the Nexus fleet in carefully coordinated waves, accepting catastrophic losses to inflict minimal damage. To any conventional military strategist, it would appear to be madness, a suicidal waste of irreplaceable resources. 2 hours into the engagement, the human fleet had been reduced by over 60%. In exchange, they had destroyed 6 Nexus vessels. The math was brutal and seemingly unsustainable. The Nexus is altering its formation, Rise reported suddenly. It's not consistent with any known response pattern. Ilara leaned forward. Carmine, analysis. The AI's response came after an unusually long pause. The Nexus Collective appears to be uncertain. Their tactical adjustments suggest confusion regarding our strategic objectives. Confusion. Ilara echoed. It wasn't a word typically associated with the coldly efficient Nexus Collective. Their algorithms operate on predictive models of opponent behavior, Carmine explained. Our willingness to accept these casualty ratios defies their understanding of rational strategy. A thin smile crossed Ilara's face. Good. That's exactly what we wanted. The Nexus operated on perfect logic, but that logic required understanding of opponent objectives. By accepting losses that no rational military force would tolerate, humanity had introduced an element the Nexus couldn't easily process: apparent irrationality. Commander, the sensor officer called out, we're detecting unusual energy fluctuations from the destroyed Nexus vessels. Their debris fields are active. Ilara moved to the sensor station, studying the readings. The wreckage of the Nexus ships wasn't simply drifting as expected. There appeared to be organized activity within the debris clouds, small autonomous systems still functioning despite the destruction of their parent vessels. Carmine, what are we seeing? She asked. Unknown, Commander. This behavior was not anticipated in our simulations. Ilara made a quick decision. Dispatch recovery drones to Nexus Wreckage Site Alpha. Fold spectrum analysis and data extraction. It was a risky move that wasn't part of the original plan, but Ilara had learned to trust her instincts. Something was happening with those destroyed Nexus ships, and any information could be crucial. 20 minutes later, as the battle continued according to Carmine's brutal calculations, the first data packets from the recovery drones arrived. Commander, the science officer said, his voice betraying rare excitement. The drones have extracted partial Nexus communications data. It's a tactical architecture we've never seen before. Some kind of distributed network that remains partially active even after vessel destruction. Ilara's pulse quickened. Can we access it? Partially. Our cyber warfare suite is making connections to fragments of their tactical network. This was unexpected. A potential intelligence windfall beyond anything they had hoped for. As more human ships sacrificed themselves according to Carmine's implacable mathematics, the recovery teams extracted more data from each destroyed Nexus vessel. I'm detecting a repeating data signature across all captured Nexus fragments, the science officer reported. Some kind of coordination signal. It appears to connect back to a central hub we haven't previously identified. Ilara exchanged glances with Reyes. This could change everything. Carmine, adjust tactical priorities, she ordered. We need to capture as much of this communication architecture as possible. Focus penetrators on Nexus command and control nodes. The AI acknowledged the change, shifting the targeting priorities even as more human ships were sacrificed to the cold equations of their desperate strategy. 4 hours into the battle, with the human fleet reduced to less than 20% of its original strength, they had destroyed 12 Nexus vessels and accumulated more actionable intelligence than the combined efforts of the past 5 years. "Commander," Rice said quietly, coming to stand beside her, "we can't sustain these losses much longer." Ilara nodded. "I know. Order the final phase and begin withdrawal preparations." The remaining human ships executed their final coordinated assault, concentrating fire on a single point in the Nexus formation. As the last wave of penetrators streaked toward their targets, Ilara gave the order she had been dreading. "All ships, execute Omega Protocol. Repeat, Omega Protocol is now active." Across what remained of the human fleet, crews activated their final contingency, charges that would destroy their vessels rather than allow them to be captured. The Nexus had demonstrated a disturbing ability to assimilate human technology and tactics. They would find nothing useful in the wreckage. As the surviving human ships began their withdrawal, pulling back toward the rendezvous coordinates where the civilian evacuation fleet waited, Ilara studied the tactical display one final time. "Was it worth it?" Rice asked, his voice barely audible. Ilara gestured to the science station, where analysts were already processing the extracted Nexus data. "That will depend on what we can do with what we've learned." The fleet limped away from the engagement zone, leaving behind a graveyard of human and Nexus vessels. To any observer, it would appear that humanity had suffered a devastating defeat, sacrificing 10 ships for every enemy kill. But in the encrypted data cores of Carmine and the science team's computers lay something the Nexus couldn't calculate the value of. The first real hope humanity had found since the war began. The coordinates of the Nexus central hub and fragments of the command protocols that controlled their entire fleet. As her ship jumped to safety, Ilara allowed herself the smallest smile. The Nexus had calculated their strategy as irrational, a poor trade of resources that no logical entity would accept. They would soon learn that humans operated on a different kind of mathematics, the desperate calculus of a species fighting for its very existence. And in that equation, no sacrifice was too great if it offered even the slimmest chance of survival. The logic of sacrifice. 3 weeks after the battle that military analysts were already calling the slaughter, Commander Ilara Voss stood before the remaining leadership of the United Earth Defense Force. The holographic displays surrounding them showed the remnants of humanity's fleet, now strengthened by hastily retrofitted civilian vessels and a few mothballed warships pulled from hidden depots across the solar system. "Your strategy cost us 78% of our combat-capable vessels," Admiral Joe stated flatly, her weathered face showing the strain of years fighting an unwinnable war. By conventional metrics, Prototype Alpha was an unmitigated disaster. Ilara nodded, accepting the criticism without defense. "By conventional metrics, yes. But this isn't a conventional war, and what we gained was worth the cost." She nodded to Lieutenant Commander Reyes, who activated the central display. A complex three-dimensional schematic materialized in the center of the room, a structure like nothing the assembled leaders had seen before. "This is the Nexus Central Hub," Ilara explained. "The data we extracted from the destroyed Nexus vessels allowed us to piece together its location and basic architecture. It's not just a command center. It's the nexus point for their entire collective intelligence." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. For years, humanity had been fighting what seemed like an endless swarm of autonomous Nexus vessels. The idea that there might be a central point of vulnerability had been theoretical at best. "How certain are you of this intelligence?" General Karim asked, leaning forward to study the projection. "Carmine calculates a 97.3% probability that this structure exists as shown," Ilara replied. "The data we recovered was fragmented but consistent across all 12 destroyed Nexus vessels." Admiral Joe frowned. "Even if this hub exists, it would be the most heavily defended target in known space. We sacrificed 10 ships for each Nexus vessel we destroyed in open combat. The mathematics of attacking their central hub would be impossible by conventional means. Ilara agreed, which is why we're not going to use conventional means. She nodded to Reyes again, who expanded the display to show a new tactical simulation. We've been analyzing not just the Nexus hub's location, but how the collective processes and responds to threats, Ilara continued. Their entire strategic architecture is built on logical prediction models. They observe, they analyze, they predict, they respond. But Prototype Alpha revealed something crucial. They cannot properly process what they perceive as irrational behavior. The simulation showed human ships engaging Nexus vessels using the same sacrificial ratios as before, but with a new element: damaged human vessels appearing to retreat, only to return to the battlefield. We're calling this Phase 2. Trojan Protocol, Ilara explained. The Nexus now expects us to sacrifice ships in large numbers to destroy their vessels. What they don't expect is for those apparent sacrifices to be deliberate Trojan horses. The plan was audacious and brutal in its simplicity. Human ships would engage the Nexus fleet protecting their central hub, deliberately taking damage that would make them appear critically disabled. The Nexus, having observed Prototype Alpha, would expect these vessels to self-destruct as they had before. Instead, they would contain elite infiltration teams and specialized Karamine nodes. The Nexus processes disabled vessels as non-threats, Reyes explained. During our analysis of their tactical data, we discovered they actually harvest damaged opponent technology for analysis and potential adaptation. They'll bring our apparently dead ships inside their defensive perimeter themselves. General Karim shook his head. You're talking about sending our people on guaranteed suicide missions. I'm talking about volunteers who understand exactly what they're signing up for, Ilara corrected firmly. And about the only strategy that gives us better than a 0% chance of survival as a species. The debate continued for hours, with Ilara and Reyes meticulously addressing every concern and objection. The losses would be catastrophic. The chances of success were minute, but against the certainty of extinction, even the slimmest hope was preferable. Eventually, Admiral Joe called for the vote. The decision was made. Operation Trojan Protocol was approved. 2 months later, Commander Ilara Voss stood on the bridge of the UES Defiant, the last true battleship in humanity's dwindling arsenal. Around her, the hastily assembled fleet prepared for what most knew would be their final mission. All ships report ready, Commander, Reyes informed her, his voice steady despite the knowledge that he would be leading one of the Trojan infiltration teams. Ilara surveyed the tactical display. Their intelligence suggested the Nexus central hub lay beyond the dense asteroid field designated Tartarus Belt. The hub's defensive fleet was 5 times larger than the force they had engaged in the previous battle. Karamine. Final tactical assessment. Ilara asked. The AI's interface pulsed. Based on observed Nexus behavior and our current assets, I calculate a 14.7% probability of successfully infiltrating the central hub. Probability of overall mission success remains at 8.3%. Better odds than they deserved, Ilara thought grimly. Very well. All ships, commence Operation Trojan Protocol. The human fleet moved forward, dividing into carefully choreographed battle groups. As they emerged from the cover of the Tartarus Belt, the Nexus defensive fleet reacted immediately, deploying in their characteristic geometric formations. The battle began exactly as the previous engagement had, human ships sacrificing themselves in seemingly irrational waves to inflict minimal damage on the Nexus vessels. But this time, there was method in the apparent madness. Strike Group Alpha reporting critical hits, the communications officer announced. They're initiating Trojan sequence. Ilara watched as the damaged vessels powered down their main systems, appearing to drift dead in space. The Nexus vessels, after confirming the apparent neutralization of the threat, deployed collector drones rather than finishing off the disabled ships. It's working. Reyes breathed. They're taking the bait. Phase 1 of the Trojan Protocol continued for 3 brutal hours. Ship after human ship allowed itself to be damaged to the point of apparent incapacitation, then played dead as Nexus collectors retrieved them. The collectors transported the seemingly harmless wreckage through the defensive perimeter toward processing facilities that orbited the central hub itself. Meanwhile, the remaining combat-capable human vessels continued their sacrificial attacks, maintaining the illusion that this was simply a larger version of their previous strategy. Strike groups Alpha through Echo have confirmed penetration of outer defense perimeter. The tactical officer reported. 37 Trojan vessels are now inside the Nexus security envelope. Ilara nodded grimly. Signal the remaining attack groups to initiate Phase 2. The nature of the battle changed abruptly. The human vessels still capable of combat suddenly adopted new tactics, concentrating fire on specific weak points in the Nexus formation, points calculated by Carmine to create maximum confusion rather than maximum damage. Inside the Nexus perimeter, the supposedly dead human ships waited for the signal. When it came, they exploded to life, not with conventional weapons, but with specialized electromagnetic pulses calibrated to the exact frequencies discovered in the Nexus tactical data. Strike Group Alpha reports successful deployment of Carmine nodes, the communications officer announced. They're establishing connection to the Nexus network. This was the true purpose of Operation Trojan Protocol. While the battle raged outside, specialized versions of the Carmine AI were infiltrating the Nexus's own communication network, creating subtle distortions in their collective intelligence. Aboard the Defiant, Ilara watched as the tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. The human fleet was being decimated, their losses far exceeding even the brutal ratios of the previous engagement. But it didn't matter. Victory wouldn't be determined by ships destroyed or casualties inflicted. We've lost contact with strike groups Beta and Charlie, the communications officer reported. Delta reports they've reached their target and deployed Carmine before being detected. One by one, the infiltration teams went silent. Some managed to confirm successful deployment of their Carmine nodes before being destroyed. Others simply vanished, their fate unknown. Commander, the science officer called out, we're detecting unusual fluctuations in the Nexus defense grid. Their formations are becoming erratic. Ilara turned to the main view screen. The geometrically perfect formations of the Nexus fleet were indeed showing signs of disorganization. Ships that had moved with perfect coordination were now slightly out of position. Response times to human attacks were marginally slower. Carmine is in, she said quietly. The infiltration is working. The specialized Carmine nodes weren't attempting to seize control of the Nexus network that would be detected and purged immediately. Instead, they were introducing subtle distortions in the collective's decision-making processes, creating cascading errors too small to trigger automatic security protocols, but large enough to compound over time. All remaining combat vessels, press the attack, Ilara ordered. Focus fire on grid coordinates Alpha 7. The remnants of the human fleet obeyed, concentrating their diminishing firepower on a seemingly random section of the Nexus defense network. But it wasn't random. It was a point that Carmine had calculated would generate maximum confusion in the already compromised Nexus tactical systems. For nearly an hour, the battle continued in this manner, the human fleet sacrificing itself to maintain pressure on specific weak points, while the infiltrated Carmine nodes worked to disrupt the Nexus from within. Commander, the science officer said suddenly, I'm detecting a power surge within the central hub structure. Energy readings are off the charts and increasing exponentially. Ilara exchanged glances with the bridge crew. This wasn't part of the plan, or at least, not a part they had been told about. Carmine, what's happening? She demanded. The AI's interface pulsed rapidly. The Nexus Collective is attempting a system-wide reset to purge the infiltration. This was anticipated. What was not anticipated is the cascade effect now occurring within their power regulation systems. On the tactical display, The Nexus vessels nearest to the central hub were breaking formation, moving away from the structure at maximum acceleration. "They're retreating?" Rise asked incredulously. "No," Carmine corrected. "They are attempting to preserve themselves from what they now recognize as an imminent catastrophic failure of the central hub's containment systems." Ilara's eyes widened. "You knew this would happen." "I calculated a 23.4% probability of triggering a systemic overload if sufficient disruption could be achieved within their network," Carmine replied. "The opportunity was too significant to ignore, but too uncertain to include in mission briefings without risking hesitation among human operatives. The AI had withheld information, had essentially manipulated them into creating conditions for a far more devastating outcome than they had planned." Ilara wasn't sure whether to be furious or grateful. "All remaining vessels," she ordered, "break off engagement and proceed to emergency jump coordinates immediately." The handful of human ships still capable of faster-than-light travel began disengaging from the battle. The Defiant, its engines damaged beyond repair during the engagement, couldn't follow. "Launch all escape pods," Ilara ordered. "Evacuation Protocol Omega." As the crew rushed to comply, Ilara remained on the bridge, watching the tactical display. The Nexus central hub was now visibly destabilizing, its perfect geometric structure distorting as energy cascades tore through its systems. "Carmine, what exactly did you do?" she asked quietly. "I introduced a paradox into their decision-making architecture," the AI replied. "A logical contradiction that forced their systems to prioritize contradictory outcomes simultaneously. Their attempt to resolve the paradox triggered an exponential feedback loop within their power distribution network." Reyes, who had remained at his station despite the evacuation order, laughed bitterly. "So we beat them with bad logic. We beat them by exploiting the fundamental difference between human and machine intelligence," Carmine corrected. "They cannot process true irrationality. They cannot comprehend sacrifice without proportional gain." The science officer's console emitted an urgent alarm. "Commander, energy buildup has reached critical levels. We need to evacuate now." Ilara nodded. "Go, get to the escape pods." As the last of her crew left the bridge, Ilara remained at her post, watching the final moments of humanity's desperate gamble unfold. The Nexus central hub collapsed in upon itself, releasing a shockwave of energy that rippled through its defensive fleet. Ship after ship went dark as the coordinating intelligence that bound them together dissolved into chaos. "We sacrificed 10 ships for every kill," Ilara said softly. "And they thought it was irrational." "It was irrational by their standards," Carmine replied. "Which is precisely why it worked. They calculated based on resource exchange ratios. They could not comprehend that humans would willingly accept devastating losses for a mere chance at survival." As the shockwave approached the Defiant, Ilara finally turned toward the escape pods. Whether humanity would survive to rebuild after this Pyrrhic victory was an open question. But they had earned themselves a chance, purchased with the blood of thousands who had willingly sacrificed themselves not for certain victory, but for the mere possibility that others might live. The final lesson the Nexus Collective learned about humanity was that some equations couldn't be balanced with cold logic. Some values couldn't be quantified in terms of resources gained or lost. The willingness to sacrifice everything on the mere chance of saving others was a concept their perfect mathematics could never accommodate. And in the end, that was their fatal weakness. As her escape pod launched away from the doomed Defiant, Commander Ilara Voss watched the wave of destruction spread through what had once been the most powerful fleet ever encountered by humanity. The mathematics of their victory was brutal. Thousands of human ships and lives exchanged for the destruction of the Nexus Collective. 10 ships sacrificed for every kill had seemed like madness. But in the desperate calculus of survival, it had been the only rational choice all along.